Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm not there. I actually love discussing completely imponderable questions like science-art interactions, but maybe we can have an exchange over the internet or so afterwards. So Tanny asked me to talk for about half an hour, so I decided to give half of a lecture that actually takes like an hour and a half or something. The second half of the lecture is this. It's about 10 kinds of art-science interactions. I tried to make a kind of survey of them. So as you can see from that list, I have this idea that really maybe this is 10 or more different subjects, if you look at it pragmatically, and really not a single subject. But the first half of that talk, which I'm going to give today, is kind of the opposite of that, because my notion is that it is possible to some degree to do a kind of conceptual analysis on claims that have been made about science-art interactions. So I've divided them into 8 models. And here they are. This is what I'm going to do for the next half hour. I'm just going to run through these in a kind of condensed way. The idea that art and science have separate grammars, I'll explain that just in a minute when I get to it. And the others are pretty self-explanatory. There have been claims that art and science share aesthetics, especially the word beauty. There have been claims that art and science collaborations comprise a third culture, opposite next to the two cultures of art and science. There's been a claim that there are many cultures and people should stop talking about the two cultures. There is a theory that I like to call the Venn diagram theory, that there is this certain area of common ground, of commonality between art and science that needs to be addressed or defined. Then there's this notion that the two confuse, or in Tanny's term, they can converge and they can produce a hybrid. There are various terms for this. And then there are people, I find them mostly they're art educators, who would like to get art and science together under the rubric of creativity or inspiration or wonder. And I have a fair number of slides on that because that really annoys me. And the last one is just something this expression that I made up a long time ago, that art and science really have a kind of drunken conversation. That is, they're very fond of each other, but they don't really know how to speak very clearly, and so they keep speaking, and then sometimes out of that kind of productive muddle, interesting things happen. Okay, so just to start out with the first of the 8, this would be the notion that science and art are two separate cultures in the way that C.P. Snow originally said it, but I'm going to put that under erasure. I'll explain in a minute why I would rather use the word grammars. So Snow's argument was originally given in 1959, and that's why I decided that the time span here is 1959 to 2017. Simon Critchley has argued that the debates that he got into are recurrent ones in English culture, and he lists a couple of precedents, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. So this two cultures idea remains a topos. There is a bibliography of Snow's of this subject, centering on Snow, which is, I think, about 30 years old and has 800 items on it. And at one point, Snow was so much besieged by invitations to talk about the two cultures that his literary agent told him not to accept any more of those invitations because it would obscure his career as a novelist, because, of course, he was trying to be a chemist and a novelist. Just as an example of how tired people are of this debate, here's an article, I guess about 10 years old now. The literature and the science of the two cultures, historiography, and the author says that what he's going to do is study the ways that people talked about these issues without making any judgment about them one way or another. In other words, the subject has receded, at least for some people, into a history in which an archaeological approach is more appropriate than a philosophic approach. But I think despite all of that, there is something very useful and enduring about this two cultures idea. But first, I think it's helpful to get rid of the word cultures, because that word is always sorry, underdefined and also overdetermined. I like to use grammars, and that's because Snow's claim of the mutual unintelligibility of the two quote-unquote cultures always turned on a lack of rudimentary knowledge of the rudiments of the foundations of art and science on the parts of the two parties involved. I just have at the bottom a couple of characteristic books. There's a nice one by Emanuel Wallerstein on the right, and Roger Kimball, the conservative art critic, his book second from the right, and that's F.R. Leavis, who at the time was just as famous as Snow, the literary critic with whom he debated and who wrote a book about this, which you can see on the left there. Anyway, to explain this idea of grammars, I'd like to reprise Snow's quote-unquote rude questions. This is the term that he used for them. That is a diagram of a Carnot heat engine, which is an illustration of the second law of thermodynamics. So there are two pairs of these rude questions. The first one is, to a gathering of people in the arts, Snow said you could ask, what is the second law of thermodynamics? And if people in the arts didn't know what it was, couldn't draw a diagram like this, for example, then he said that that would be equivalent to going into a group of scientists and saying, who wrote Hamlet? Equivalent degree of ignorance. Sorry. Second pair of questions, which he takes to be equivalent, is this. If you go into a gathering of people in the arts and say, can you define mass and acceleration? And if they can't really do it, that would show an equivalent degree of ignorance if you had gone into a group of scientists and said, can you read? These questions, Snow's rude questions, got even ruder in the hands of Alan Sokal, who's a physicist who was teaching at the time at NYU. He had this idea. You could ask average people in the arts or elsewhere, do you believe the universe is made of atoms? And Sokal says, yes, most people would say that they thought that it is. But then Sokal would say, what proof do you have? And this was a way of showing abysmal ignorance on the part of average people that they couldn't, he thinks the average person couldn't come up with a single experiment or anything empirical or anything concrete in science having to do with this to help answer this question. So that's three sets of really, really rude questions, and I will say in just a minute why I think that they're sort of a core of this two cultures issue. But first, a little bit about Sokal. For those of you who don't know him, he was involved in this hoax. He wrote an essay which was supposedly about the confluence between recent science, which he actually does know, and trends in the arts and humanities, especially postmodernist trends. This article was completely a hoax. Every single line in it, these ones I'm underlining, for example, every single line in it was false. And in the end of the article, he claimed that he was going to make a parallel between postmodernism and developments in quantum gravity. Then he published an essay which went line by line through the first essay, proving that everything in it was not only false, but false in a very simple-minded way, so that the editors of the journal that had accepted it showed their ignorance of science by accepting it, and he made fools of all of them. And that became a huge controversy, and then he wrote a book about it with a scholar named Brishmont, that's on the upper right. And then he wrote another book about it, Beyond the Hoax, and he has a website, which is maybe not the world's most modest website, has much, much, much more about this. And if you do a Google image search, which I was looking for, pictures of Sokal, you also turn up Chomsky, and for some reason, what's that guy's name? Patrick Stewart. And Derrida was implicated because there are chapters in the book Fashionable Nonsense that show that people like Derrida and Kristeva and some other post-structuralists had a tremendous ignorance of the rudiments of science. Anyway, the reason why I think this is an enduring question is that there still remains this basic this basic problem of communicating between arts and sciences if the rudiments aren't on what one side thinks of as rudiments are not known by people on the other side. So you could think that maybe some contemporary equivalents would be something like, what is postmodernism, what is kitsch, what is the avant-garde? The general idea here is that a lack of knowledge of these, what I'm calling grammars, is a reason to say that art and science are distinct, because that limits conversations to generalities or popularizations in the case of science, or excerpts, or just impressions. So even though the questions are rude in the sense that they are unformed in the original sense of that word, and therefore they're not part of a more general conversation, still I think there's a certain inescapability about the notion that if you don't know the grammar of a language, the basic grammar of a language, basic terminology of a language, then you're limited in what you can say about that in that language. The second of the 8 is this. There have been these claims that art and science share aesthetics, especially terms like beauty, elegance, the sublime, and so on. There is this fabulous essay by Leo Steinberg called Art and Science, Should They Be Yoked?, which is, I think, in the journal Antaeus way back in 1974. It's a report about a visit that he made to a conference full of scientists who he says were congratulating each other on having so much in common with artists. They were using aesthetic terms to make those claims. Steinberg writes, at this table, 3 criteria have been proposed to characterize the products of art: an interest in the specific materiality of things, elegance in composition, and the emotion of delight. It seems to me each of these is problematic. He says that conceptual art has cast some doubt on the idea that all art is interested in materiality in the way that science is, but he spends most of his time on elegance and delight. And he cites what was then forthcoming book by David Friedberg, Power of Images, which is in part about attacks that have been made on artworks, 2 famous ones I'm putting on screen there. He cites that work as evidence that whatever elegance might mean in art, it obviously means something different than it does in science. So he just asks in a very clever and somewhat snide way to the scientist this rhetorical, unanswerable question: is this elegance? Is this what you mean by beauty? Just by way of saying that if you try to make the bridge between science and art using words like elegance and pattern and beauty and the sublime and so on, others that are still often used, then you may not get very far. On the other hand, because there's always an other hand of this, it is possible that aesthetic terms can work in this wider way that Steinberg intended, even when they are applied to science. And I take as an example here Adam Zaretsky, the bioart person. He talks about scientists as, quote, sculptors who works through what I call aesthetics, using, quote, versions of beauty. This is a close-up of one of his modifications of pheasant embryos. I'll show another one again in a few minutes and say a bit more about it. So Adam is never unironic, and there is a complicated context and history to disentangle here. Nevertheless, there are these intriguing usages which would conform more closely to the kind of thing that Steinberg says. And in fact, he ends his essay by saying that he can't really say if art and science shouldn't, in fact, be quote-unquote yoked, because it's a question that goes back and forth. The third of the 8 is the idea that art and science collaborations are a third culture to go along with the 2 cultures of art and science. That's Victoria Vesna, who's argued along these lines. So take her essay from Leonardo in 2001 as an example of this. She thinks that, I'm on the third paragraph here, the third culture will emerge out of triangulation of the arts, sciences, and humanities, and elsewhere in the essay she says art, science, and technology. Of course, the question in claims like this is what that third culture will be and how it might be defined. So in a way, I think of this model, the third model, as a kind of placeholder for maybe a future account. Fourth model is that science and art may very well be 2 cultures or 2 grammars or 2 discourses, but that there are many more, and so it doesn't. It has limited use to say that there are actually only 2. And a good example of this is Evelina Domnich and Dmitry Jeffland, who do all kinds of work collaborating with scientists and creating new configurations of art and science. And I will show a couple slides of their work toward the end. But they would be an example of art science people who don't worry about this distinction, because science and art end up in their work effectively divided. Science gets divided into technologies, also into disciplines, of course, but into technologies primarily, and art gets divided into media. And that asymmetric division is itself kind of interesting, but it's not my subject today. The fifth of the models is that science and art have a common ground. This is what I call the Venn diagram claim. Roger Molina, who's the longtime editor of Leonardo, is an example of this. He's argued that there are, quote, more shared traits of personality and cognitive strategy than there are differences between artists and scientists. This Venn diagram claim takes a number of entirely different forms because it's just an armature, it's just a claim of intersection. And one of the most interesting of these forms is this book by E.O. Wilson called Consilience. which claims, quote, the common property of science and art is the transmission of information, and the respective modes of transmission in science and art can be made logically equivalent. There's a literature on this, a big literature on this. There was a large response, a number of reviews. But I just want to note that this approach is very susceptible to Snow's and Sokol's kinds of quote-unquote rude grammatical sort of objections, because you could ask, if you're talking about information, how much information you can transmit if you're lacking elements of grammar and terminology that are more or less fundamental to the discourses in question. In other words, does consilience have to happen at a higher level of generality, and are you therefore maybe talking about a blurry Venn diagram? I'm messing up my metaphor there, but does the Venn diagram really hold when you're actually changing the nature of the discourse in order to find that area of intersection? Sixth of the claims is that science and art can fuse to form something new, to form a hybrid. There is the mashup word art science that was popularized by David Edwards in 2008. And there's also art/science, art-science, art_science, and others as well. They all suggest, and the rhetoric around them suggests, that there can be something that can come out of the confluence of these two ways of working, ways of thinking, that will produce something that is a new term that needs to be named differently. And I'm first calling it hybrid term, but hybrid is actually not a very good word, because hybrid is actually a word that was introduced into cultural studies by Homi Bhabha. And Homi Bhabha's original essays on hybridity, they're very typical Homi Bhabha texts. I mean, they're very dense and psychoanalytic, and not widely applicable. And then there's this kind of watered down notion of hybridity that circulates in the art world, in which it sort of means graft or something that it's not actually supposed to, that wasn't intended originally. Tanny's questions are maybe better ones. If you focus on the word convergence or synthesis, I think that might be a little bit more promising. But all of these claims, I find, tend to devolve into juxtapositions. And the whole notion of this sixth model would be that a juxtaposition has been somehow transcended or rearranged, deconstructed and reconstructed into new combinations. These words like synthesis and convergence are very slippery, and I just want to mention something we're doing at the Art Institute, which is pertinent to this. We have a series of one-day events that we've been doing. We've done 3 of them. We're going to do 2 more, and then we're going to publish a bunch of short books on it. And these are short books that are intended to be used as manuals about the ways that people that assess art and evaluate art students. Synthesis is actually a word that we studied in the first year, the first volume that we produced. And it's a difficult word. It has a long history, and it especially goes back to Platonism and Plotinus. It's a very important word, not just in art science circles, but it's absolutely crucial to art assessment and art evaluation, as in the middle paragraph there. Statements like, the student will learn to synthesize form and content. And our point in this series is that almost no administrator who uses a word like this actually knows what it means, because it's actually ambiguous and works in directions that would go away from what administrators hope, that is to say, to quantify their outcomes of their learning outcomes and so on, and to work with accreditation agencies and to have a kind of a quantifiable educational experience that they can offer. So the way I look at this set of claims is that none of these concepts that end up getting deployed, hybrid, convergence, synthesis, unity, coherence, none of them are straightforward. I think of them more as aspirational. So I suppose, again, you could say that it's a kind of a placeholder theory that is still waiting for a full analysis. Back to Adam Zaretsky for a minute. So he used this tattoo gun a couple years ago to insert a plasmid that he called lunatic fringe, which is typical Adam. Lunatic fringe multiplies elements like limbs and so on into pheasant embryos. And the embryos were not allowed to develop. one that died after this tattooing because it was, deliberate misuse of technology. One of them he buried in a, quote, Neo-Egyptian mummification, along with myrrh, salt, and limestone. So Adams says it's okay to have feelings for things, even like blastulas, because they have, quote, dignity to a certain extent. It's a phrase that would just absolutely infuriate a Republican legislator. They go through, quote, coordinated yogic moves, for example, that burrow and fold in. So you could ask of a question like this, is this a hybrid practice? Or I think in a trivial sense it is, but it also points or points to the difficulty of finding a genuine example of hybridity, because this seems to me to trace its historical lineage goes back to surrealism, because it's an unexpected convergence, which is one of the principal definitions of surrealism, and therefore not toward hybridity. Is it a convergence? I doubt it, because I kind of doubt scientists are going to be on board, or were on board with some of the things that Adam did there in that lab. Is it a synthesis, though? Possibly, because there it is, all in one presentation, all in one set of photographs and artist statements and things like that. So again, it's a tricky subject, but it needs more precision of definition. The seventh model is the idea that art and science share qualities like creativity, wonder, or inspiration. This is David Edwards, who's the founder of the Art Science Labs at Harvard, and he said, quote, innovation as a creative process that is neither completely aesthetic nor scientific, but a fusion of the deductive logic of scientific experimentation with the intuitive inspiration of artistic creation is what they're after. At Harvard. Roger Molina has quoted Robert Bernstein. He's an early winner of the MacArthur Fellowship. He's been studying creativity for a long time. Molina says Bernstein has, quote, shown that the most successful artists and engineers compared to the general population are very engaged in activities that are arts avocations. Their own research practice is fed by their arts thinking and avocations. That was a couple years ago. So this idea of creativity as the bridge, it's something that particularly annoys me, because it keeps coming up in art school and art department assessment and accreditation literature. So when I'm asked to sit on panels and give lectures on those subjects, creativity is a very common topic of conversation. So I'm going to make my parentheses of about 8 slides here. So Molina says that he was skeptical of it. Creativity, third paragraph there, creativity was almost always a dirty word at the end of NSF-NEA workshops. And yet, he concludes with, quote, the idea that we need to innovate in creativity thinking itself. So there's this kind of return of creativity. You can't completely get rid of it. That's the entrance to Tokyo Gedai, the main art school in Tokyo, and I have it on screen there because it's a good example of how this word creativity can really get a bit out of control. This is from their own promotional material from 2014, and I've just underlined the number of times that forms of the word creativity show up just on this one page. So difficult to extricate it from a rhetoric that's so thoroughly entangled with it. The way that I would argue against the use of creativity in this context would be just to point to the number of different definitions that's been given. Because unlike synthesize and converge and others, there really is a pertinent contemporary literature on this, not just a philosophic history. So here are some examples. This is a cartoon someone made about Howard Gardner, who's the one who got the idea that everyone has multiple intelligences, extremely influential idea. I met him once at MoMA, and this was like about 5 years ago, and at that point he had 25 honorary degrees. It's a very widely applicable and useful theory for a lot of people, this multiple intelligences theory. But creativity is not a major part of his theory. He has distributed it in different ways, and it also exists as one of the subgroups of one of his intelligences. So it's not he's not a helpful source for this, even though he's often cited. I think the most influential theory is Joy Guilford's theory from, it's a mid-20th century theory. And one of the ways that it's visualized is like this, with a kind of Rubik's Cube, or it's actually it's an XYZ coordinate system of different kinds of intelligences. And creativity is under operations. So in that little picture on the lower part, there's operations, and it's under the subcategory of divergent production. It's a category within that. So again, it's a minor category. And just to show you, Guilford's system has been visualized many times in many different ways, but creativity remains a subcategory. Guilford also used to do these creativity tests according to different parameters. So you have you present people with 5 empty circles, and they have a time limit of 2 minutes, and they have to draw as much as they can in it, and then you grade them for their different according to different criteria: fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. Creativity ends up being the overarching criterion for these, but it's still a very small part of that her system. And then there's this, Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats theory, in which we all think with 6 hats, and creativity is again way down there. It's one of the, I guess it's the major green branch. Anyway, that's just to telegraph problems with depending on creativity. Wonder is just as often used, like in this graphic. There's a number of these Venn diagram graphics with science, art, and wonder floating around the internet. It just seems to me that these general terms like creativity, wonder, and intuition, and so on, can really can't do very much work in specific contexts. They seem to be more like administrative categories to help along language which needs some substantive in its sentences in order to make cogent claims, or to take it to be cogent claims. Okay, so I'm just going to end up with this. This is that's a page from my website, and it's this essay that I wrote a long time ago called "The Drunken Conversation Between Chaos and Painting." So that's, I hoped, generalizable, and what I meant was that science and art in general, because that was at the time chaos theory and painting, like Mark Tansey's and so on. But the notion was that to call the relation between these two areas drunken wasn't meant to be an insult. I was trying to register that some or all of these positions that I've numbered here as 7, but in this early essay I didn't do it that way. But the notion was that all positions can be taken to mingle implicitly in science art projects, and none of them might make a whole lot of sense, but they can be very useful because they can be enabling. I'm going to close with 2 points which would be maybe interesting for discussion. First is that I think it's entirely possible that even if the art-science conversation is a drunken conversation, even if the quote-unquote cultures or grammars remain distinct, it's still possible that art-science work can produce interesting science and art, which have then sometimes gone forward in their respective disciplines. So that would mean that this search for third terms or syntheses, convergences, conciliations, and all that may be a kind of desire, which is not a necessary criterion, but not a necessary criterion by art or science standards. And my closing example here is another thing that Evelina and Dimitri did, and that is this. It was a project of, having to do with a phenomenon called sonoluminescence, where you have high-frequency sound that goes through a fluid and produces light and cavitation, that is, little bubbles. And we were corresponding about this a couple years ago, and they were citing this as an example of a science-art collaboration that actually produced new science. There's the new science on the left, and that's Evelina's description of it on the right. It's not the aim of most art science projects to have the art create new science, but it is a really interesting, if severe and sometimes inappropriate criterion for the strength of an art-science collaboration, that the art could do something more than just visualize the science or promote the science or reframe the science, but could actually push the science forward. Nevertheless, it does happen. And the interesting thing in the context of what I've been saying here is that these kinds of results don't require clarity on any of these 7 or 8 models. They can still work when those models are adduced in all sorts of muddled or incomplete ways. It's not a pertinent problem. So there's the summary of the 8 theories, or I guess it's 7 theories and then a theory about the theories or something anyway. I'm not invested in the number 8. I put the ellipsis down at the bottom just to signal that it's just a matter of, for heuristic purposes, I think it's useful to divide these in this way. And then just to end, just to make a different sort of point as my last point, so the second lecture that goes with it, that's the one with the 10 examples of different kind of projects. It goes in a different direction because most art science doesn't interrogate these models at all or in any consistent way. So it seems to me that it's important to note that a lot of art science work, collaborations, publications, institutional initiatives, grants, residencies, fellowships, a lot of it is enabled by not worrying about these abstract questions. In other words, it wouldn't be possible if you did worry about them. You would maybe go in a completely different direction than you have been intending, and maybe the entire collaboration, quote unquote, hybrid, whatever you want to call it, wouldn't work at all. Okay, so on that ambiguous and I hope optimistic note, I guess I'd say that's about it, and I'm looking forward to conversations over the internet. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.